20 years later, that same company built the phone every teenager in America begged for at Christmas. The thin, silver flip phone that snapped shut with a sound people still remember. And 9 years after that, Motorola's American phone business was gone, sold off in pieces to a Chinese conglomerate for a fraction of what it had once been worth. How does the company that invented the mobile phone lose the mobile revolution it started? This is the story of the brand that gave America its first taste of a wireless life and then let it slip away. Chicago, September 1928. Paul Galvin was 33 years old, and this was not his first attempt at a business. He had already tried and failed twice, once with a battery company that collapsed when the market shifted beneath him. Most men would have called that enough. Paul Galvin called it tuition. Together with his younger brother Joseph, Paul walked into a small office at 847 West Harrison Street with 5 employees and $565 in working capital. Their new venture was called Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, and its first product was almost forgettable: a battery eliminator, a small device that let battery-powered radios run on ordinary household electricity instead. It was practical, it was modest. It was not the beginning most people would recognize as the start of an empire. Then came October 1929, and the stock market collapsed around them. The market for battery eliminators, already shrinking as radios moved toward household current on their own, disappeared almost overnight. The Galvin brothers were staring at the same choice thousands of small manufacturers faced that year: fold or find something else to sell. They chose the car radio. It was not an obvious bet. Car radios existed already, but they were expensive, bulky, and unreliable. A luxury item for the wealthy few who could afford one. Paul Galvin believed there was a much larger audience waiting: ordinary drivers who wanted music and news on the road. If only someone could make the radio smaller, cheaper, and sturdy enough to survive the vibration of an American highway. In 1930, Galvin Manufacturing introduced the Motorola 5T71, a name Paul coined by combining motor for the automobile with ola, a suffix that in that era suggested sound. The radio sold for around $100 to $130, roughly half the price of its competitors, and it found its first serious customers not among everyday drivers, but among police departments who needed reliable communication on patrol. That was the pattern that would define Motorola for the next 50 years. Build the thing people did not know they needed yet, price it so it could actually reach them, and let public safety and everyday Americans discover it together. The company barely survived its first year. It would go on to invent the car radio industry, the walkie-talkie, and eventually the mobile phone itself. The company Paul and Joseph Galvin built in those first hard years was small enough that everyone on the payroll knew each other by name, and desperate enough that the brothers themselves often worked the factory floor alongside the employees they had hired. There was no research division, no marketing department, no cushion of outside investment to fall back on if the car radio failed the way the battery eliminator business had. What there was instead was a stubbornness that would come to define the company's culture for decades. The belief that the right answer to a shrinking market was not retreat, but a better product, sold at a price ordinary people could actually pay. By 1947, the small manufacturer from Harrison Street had grown enough and built enough of a reputation that the Galvin family formally renamed it Motorola, folding the name of its first hit product into the identity of the entire company. Paul's son Robert, called Bob by nearly everyone who worked with him, joined the business as a young man and rose steadily through its ranks, absorbing his father's instinct for betting on technology before the market had fully proven it wanted that technology yet. Paul Galvin never lived to see the mobile phone. He died in 1959, not long after handing formal control of the company to Bob, who would lead Motorola for the next 3 decades. But the belief he planted in that small Chicago office in 1928, that ordinary Americans deserved the same technology once reserved for the privileged, would carry the company through the Depression, through a world war, and into a race that no one else in the world was running yet. The race to put a working telephone in a human hand, with no wire attached to anything at all. On April 3, 1973, A Motorola engineer named Martin Cooper stood on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan, holding a device that looked like nothing else in the world. A gray plastic block nearly a foot long, with a stubby antenna and a weight that strained the wrist. Before walking into a scheduled press conference, Cooper raised the device to his ear and placed a call to a rival engineer at Bell Labs, the company racing Motorola to build the same thing. It was, by every account, a moment of pure theater and pure engineering triumph at once. A phone call made from an open sidewalk, with no car, no wire, no booth. It would take Motorola 10 more years and roughly $100 million in investment before that prototype became something Americans could actually buy. On September 21st, 1983, the Federal Communications Commission approved the Motorola Dynatac 8000X, the world's first commercial handheld cellular phone. It went on sale the following year for just under $4,000, a price that put it well out of reach for most families, but that did not stop it from becoming an instant symbol of arrival. To be seen holding a Dynatac in 1984 was to be seen as someone whose time mattered enough to be reachable anywhere. Real estate agents carried them. Wall Street traders carried them. It became a fixture in movies about wealth and power, a visual shorthand that needed no explanation. This person is important, and this person can be called at any moment. For everyday customers, the Dynatac was still mostly a distant dream, something glimpsed rather than owned. But Motorola kept shrinking the idea, and each new version pulled the mobile phone a little closer to ordinary American life. The Microtac arrived in 1989, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket and light enough that carrying it did not feel like carrying a tool. Then in 1996 came the phone that many people who lived through that decade still describe with genuine affection, the StarTAC. It was Motorola's first true clamshell, a phone that folded closed with a satisfying snap and opened with a flick of the wrist. It looked more than a little intentionally like something out of science fiction, and it made owning a cell phone feel less like a business necessity and more like carrying a small piece of the future in a coat pocket. By the late 1990s, Motorola phones were no longer a novelty for the wealthy. They were becoming a genuine fixture of American middle-class life, clipped to a belt at a construction site, tucked into a purse at a PTA meeting, sitting on the passenger seat of a minivan on the way to soccer practice. Parents bought them for teenagers heading off to college, so they could call home. Salespeople bought them because being unreachable had quietly become a professional liability. The phone that once belonged only to the rich now belonged, in a very real sense, to the country. What people who owned a Motorola phone in that era remember is not a spec sheet. It is the weight of the phone in a coat pocket. It is the particular click of a StarTAC snapping shut after a call, a small mechanical punctuation mark that meant a conversation was over. It is the pride, quiet but real, of being one of the first people in a friend group or a family to own one, of unfolding it at a restaurant table and feeling, for just a moment, like the future had arrived a little early. Inside Motorola's own hallways in Illinois, engineers who had spent a decade shrinking radios into pockets described those years as the payoff for everything that came before. What had started as a stubborn bet about car radios in 1930 had become the company that quite literally invented the way an entire country would communicate for the next generation. Six Sigma, the rigorous quality process Motorola pioneered internally in 1986, became such a respected standard of manufacturing discipline that companies far outside the phone business adopted it as their own. Motorola was not just making phones. It was setting the standard for how things should be made. What none of them yet knew was that the very thing making them so successful, a genius for hardware, for shrinking and refining a physical object, would one day become the reason they could not keep up with a very different kind of revolution. The Dynatac itself carried a story worth remembering on its own terms. Motorola had begun serious work on a handheld cellular phone in the early 1970s, driven partly by fear that AT&T, the dominant telephone monopoly of the era, would use its control of car phone technology to lock up the mobile communications market before anyone else had a chance to compete. That fear pushed Motorola to gamble on something genuinely radical. A phone not bolted into a car, but small enough eventually to carry in a hand. It took a decade of engineering, $100 million of investment, and the construction of an entirely new cellular network architecture before the FCC finally granted approval in September 1983. When the DynaTAC 8000X reached stores the following year, it could store 30 phone numbers, needed a full 10 hours on a charger for 30 minutes of talk time, and yet outsold every expectation Motorola's own executives had set for it. For the police officers, firefighters, and public safety workers who had trusted Motorola radios for 2 generations by the 1980s, the arrival of the cellular phone felt less like a leap and more like a natural next step from a company that had never stopped inventing. For everyday Americans, it was something closer to witnessing magic. The first time many people had ever seen a phone call placed from the middle of a parking lot, a golf course, or a sidewalk, with no visible wire connecting the caller to anything at all. By the time the StarTAC reached store shelves in 1996, Motorola had spent nearly a quarter-century compressing that original DynaTAC brick down to something that fit in a shirt pocket. The StarTAC's clamshell design, inspired by the fictional communicators of science fiction television, was small enough and light enough that people began carrying it the way they carried keys or wallets. Not as a special occasion device, but as something simply present every day without a second thought. By the early 2000s, Motorola was no longer thinking in terms of a single hit product. It was thinking in terms of an entire catalog. The company that had once needed a decade to move from prototype to store shelf was now releasing new phone models constantly, chasing every price point and every taste. Flip phones, candy bar phones, phones for teenagers, phones for executives, phones sold through nearly every carrier in the country. The engine behind that growth was not franchising, the way it might have been for a restaurant chain, and it was not a single flagship store network, the way it might have been for a department store. It was distribution, deals with wireless carriers across the United States and around the world, each one eager to put Motorola handsets in front of their customers, because Motorola's name still carried the weight of having invented the category in the first place. Every carrier wanted a Motorola phone on its shelf. That gave the company a kind of built-in national footprint that few competitors could match. Then in 2004 came the product that would define the decade, the Razr V3. It was strikingly thin for its time, milled from aluminum rather than molded plastic, and it looked less like a piece of consumer electronics and more like a piece of jewelry. Motorola initially positioned it as a premium, almost exclusive item. A fashion statement first, a phone second. Within about a year, the price came down, the carrier deals widened, and the Razr stopped being an exclusive luxury and became something close to a national uniform. By the middle of 2006, more than 50 million units had already been sold, and by the time its production run finally slowed, the Razr had sold more than 130 million phones worldwide, the best-selling clamshell phone in history. That kind of scale required an entirely different kind of company than the one that had carefully hand-built the DynaTAC 2 decades earlier. Factories across multiple countries ran around the clock. Engineering teams that had once obsessed over a single flagship device now split their attention across dozens of variations of the same basic shape, chasing every carrier request and every regional preference. For the employees living through it, this was a heady, exhausting kind of pride. The sense of building something that entire families across the country were lining up to own, alongside the growing pressure of feeding a product pipeline that never seemed to stop demanding more. It is worth pausing on what that expansion meant for the company's own sense of itself. Motorola had built its reputation, generation after generation, on invention. The car radio no one else had thought to shrink, the walkie-talkie that helped win a war, the phone that made calling from a sidewalk possible. Now the company's growth engine was running on refinement of a single winning shape rather than the pursuit of the next fundamentally new idea. The Razr was thinner, lighter, and available in more colors than any phone before it, but it was still underneath the aluminum shell, doing exactly what phones had done for a decade, making calls and sending texts. Somewhere in the excitement of 130 million units sold, a much quieter question was starting to form in a handful of labs, both inside Motorola and outside it. A question about what might come after the phone stopped being just a phone. The Razr's success also reshaped how Motorola thought about its own retail relationships. In the years before the flip phone's launch, wireless carriers had treated handset makers largely as interchangeable suppliers, one brand of plastic and circuitry standing in for another. The Razor changed that dynamic almost overnight. Carriers competed with one another for exclusive colors, launch windows, and marketing tie-ins, eager to be associated with the single hottest consumer product in the country. Motorola, for a few remarkable years, held genuine leverage over the companies that controlled access to American phone customers. A level of influence the company would never fully recapture once the smartphone era arrived and shifted that leverage decisively toward Apple. Inside the company's engineering divisions, the Razor's runaway success created its own kind of institutional gravity. Teams that might otherwise have been assigned to explore entirely new categories of device were instead pulled toward producing variations on the winning shape. Thinner razors, razors in new colors, razors bundled with new camera features. It was, by every reasonable business logic of the moment, the correct decision. Why abandon a design still selling in the tens of millions to chase something unproven? But it meant that as the middle of the decade approached, an enormous share of Motorola's talent and capital was devoted to perfecting a shape rather than questioning what might eventually replace it. By the middle of the 2000s, Motorola had achieved something remarkably few companies ever manage. It had become a genuinely unifying piece of American life, recognized and desired across nearly every demographic line the country could draw. Teenagers wanted a Razor for the same reason their parents once wanted a StarTAC, because it represented the newest, sleekest version of something that had already become essential. Grandparents who had never owned a cell phone in their lives were persuaded to get their first one specifically because a Motorola model looked simple enough to trust and stylish enough not to feel embarrassing. The Razor's cultural reach went well beyond the electronics aisle. It showed up on magazine covers as a design object in its own right, not merely a gadget review. It became a fixture in music videos and red carpet photographs, held up almost like an accessory, its thin silver body catching camera flashes the way a piece of fine jewelry might. Being seen with one signaled something specific about a person in that moment. Someone current, someone who paid attention, someone who was not behind. Inside Motorola's Illinois headquarters, this was the payoff two full generations of engineers had been building towards since Paul Galvin's small office on Harrison Street. The company that had once needed police departments to prove a car radio was worth the price now had teenagers begging their parents for its product at Christmas. Employees who had spent careers in a company known mostly to telecommunications insiders were suddenly working for one of the most recognized consumer names in the country. That recognition traveled up and down family trees in a way few technology products ever manage. A father who bought a Dynatac in 1984 to look important at the office, buying his daughter a Razor 20 years later to look current with her friends, and later still, a grandchild recognizing the Motorola name from stories told at the dinner table about that first heavy brick phone that used to sit in the family car. This was the moment worth lingering on, because it would not last. For a handful of years in the middle of the 2000s, Motorola was not simply a phone company competing for market share. It was, in the truest sense of the phrase, America's brand. The name that had taken a technology once reserved for Wall Street traders and real estate agents and made it something every family, across every income bracket, could reasonably hope to own. What made it here mattered more than any spreadsheet. 3 generations of the same family, at 3 different decades, each finding their own reason to trust the same name. What was it about that thin silver shell, sitting in a coat pocket or a purse, that made an entire country feel like it was carrying the future? For the men and women who had spent their careers at Motorola's Illinois facilities, this period carried a particular kind of professional pride that went beyond a paycheck. Many had joined the company specifically because of its reputation as an engineering institution, a place where the physical craft of building something excellent for its own sake still mattered. Watching that craft translate into a product genuinely beloved by tens of millions of ordinary Americans, rather than simply respected within the narrow world of telecommunications engineers, was a kind of validation the company had rarely experienced so completely or so publicly before. That validation extended into the broader Chicago region as well, where Motorola had long been one of the largest and most respected employers in the local technology economy. Suburban communities around the company's Schaumburg headquarters had grown in part around the steady employment Motorola provided across generations of engineers, assemblers, and support staff. For those communities, the Razor's success was not an abstract business triumph. It was the tangible, visible proof that the hometown company could still stand shoulder to shoulder with any technology brand in the world. The reach of the brand crossed geographic and economic lines that few consumer products ever managed to bridge in the same era. In wealthy suburbs, the Razor was purchased in the newest color the moment it arrived. In working-class households, families saved for months to buy one, aware of exactly what it signaled the moment it was pulled from a pocket at school or at work. It was a rare kind of product that meant roughly the same thing: arrival, currency, belonging, no matter which zip code it was carried in. Television and film of the period leaned into that shared recognition constantly, using a razor flip open in a scene as an unspoken shorthand for a character who was current, plugged in, aware of the cultural moment. Audiences did not need the detail explained to them. They already carried the same phone, or wanted to. Behind the celebration, in labs far from the spotlight, a very different kind of company was quietly getting ready to answer that question in a way no one at Motorola had yet imagined. In January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced a device that did not look like a phone at all: a slab of glass with no keypad, no flip mechanism, and no antenna in sight. Inside Motorola, the reaction, according to people who worked there at the time, was closer to skepticism than alarm. The device had no physical keyboard. Its battery life was reportedly modest. It was, by the hardware standards Motorola had spent 80 years perfecting, an unfinished product. That instinct was not unreasonable on its own. Motorola had built its entire identity on hardware mastery. Thinner phones, lighter phones, more elegant phones. Judged purely as an object, the first iPhone was not obviously superior to a Razor. But the iPhone was never really competing on hardware alone. It was introducing something Motorola had never needed to build before: a genuine software ecosystem, a touchscreen interface designed from the ground up rather than adapted from a keypad phone, and an app store that would eventually turn the device into a platform rather than just a phone. The irony was not lost on those who had followed the company's history closely. Motorola had spent nearly a century being the company that saw a technological shift coming before anyone else. The shift from wired radios to wireless, from car phones to handheld phones, from bulky bricks to pocket-sized clamshells. Now, for what may have been the first time in its history, Motorola found itself on the wrong side of a shift it had not seen coming, watching a computer company with no history in telephones redefine what a phone was supposed to do. Inside Motorola, the primary crack was not a single bad decision. It was a company culture built almost entirely around industrial design and hardware engineering. Now facing a competitor whose core advantage was software, it had barely begun to take seriously. Motorola's phones still ran on interfaces that felt, next to the iPhones, dated, clunky menus, inconsistent software across different models, no unifying platform tying the experience together. The very quality that had made Motorola great, its obsession with the physical object, had quietly become its blind spot. Secondary pressures compounded the problem. Google's Android operating system, launched in 2008, gave Motorola and every other traditional hardware maker a path to compete on software without building an entire ecosystem from scratch. But adopting Android also meant admitting the company could no longer lead on its own terms. And the Razor's staggering commercial success had, in a strange way, become its own trap. A decade of chasing variations on one winning shape had left the company with far less appetite and far less institutional muscle for the kind of fundamental reinvention in the smartphone era demanded. Customers did not notice the shift immediately. Through 2007 and into 2008, plenty of American households still carried Motorola flip phones, still trusted the name that had once made the very idea of a mobile phone possible. But sales figures inside the company told a quieter story. Within roughly a year of the iPhone's release, Motorola's phone sales had fallen by more than half. The Razr, once impossible to walk past in a store without noticing, was starting to look like yesterday's future. Inside the company's own product meetings, according to later accounts from people who worked through that period, there was no shortage of engineers who understood exactly what the iPhone represented. Some had pushed internally for years for a more ambitious software strategy, for a genuine operating system built for touch rather than a keypad. Those voices existed. What they lacked was the institutional weight to redirect a company whose entire promotion ladder, whose entire definition of engineering excellence, still ran through hardware refinement. A gifted software architect inside Motorola in 2006 or 2007 was, in a very real sense, working against the current of the company's own culture rather than with it. Motorola's response, when it came, arrived in fragments rather than as a single coherent strategy. New phone models launched with incremental software improvements that never quite closed the gap the iPhone had opened. Executives spoke publicly about smartphones as an important future category, even as the company's day-to-day engineering priorities remained anchored to the physical design triumphs of the Razr years. The company that had once needed only 10 years to go from prototype to a phone Americans could hold in a hand now, found itself needing far longer to answer a competitor that had reset the terms of the entire industry in a single afternoon on a stage in San Francisco. How long could a brand built entirely on hardware supremacy survive a war being fought, for the first time, primarily over software? The decisions that proved fatal to Motorola's mobile phone business were rarely dramatic in the moment. They were the accumulated weight of a company continuing to do what had always worked for years after it had stopped working. The most consequential of these decisions was less a single choice than an inherited worldview. For nearly 80 years, success at Motorola had meant winning on hardware. A smaller radio, a lighter phone, a thinner shell. That worldview had built the company's entire engineering culture, its promotion structures, its sense of what genius looked like inside its own walls. When the industry's center of gravity shifted towards software and ecosystem design, Motorola did not lack talented engineers who understood what was happening. What it lacked was a culture willing to treat software as seriously as it had always treated hardware. A willingness documented by former employees and analysts alike who described a company that kept pouring resources into refining the Razr's shape long after refinement had stopped being the thing that mattered. By 2007 through 2009, the financial toll of that gap became impossible to ignore. Motorola lost more than $4 billion over those 3 years, a staggering reversal for a company that had defined its category only a few years earlier. The scale of that loss is worth sitting with for a moment. This was not a company on the margins of its industry stumbling under new competition. This was the company that had invented the category itself, watching 4 decades of accumulated engineering leadership erode inside a single presidential term. Part of what made the decline so difficult to reverse was the very success that had preceded it. Executives who had spent their careers being rewarded for hardware refinement were, understandably, slow to conclude that the entire basis of that reward system needed to change. Board members and investors, watching the Razr's staggering unit sales, even as smartphone competitors gained ground, had reasonable grounds to believe the company's traditional strengths would eventually reassert themselves, the way they always had before. That belief, defensible in 2007, looked increasingly costly by 2009. On January 4, 2011, the company split into 2 separate public entities: Motorola Solutions, which kept the profitable public safety and enterprise communications business, and Motorola Mobility, which carried the struggling consumer phone division into an uncertain future on its own. For the employees inside Motorola Mobility, the split was less a fresh start than a signal that the parent company itself no longer believed the phone business could be fixed from within. Many had spent entire careers building the very products now seen as a drag on the larger corporation. The pride of having once made the phone every teenager in America wanted for Christmas sat uneasily alongside the reality of a business unit now valued mainly for what could be salvaged from it. That salvage came in 2012, when Google announced it was acquiring Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion. Publicly, the deal was framed as a chance to rebuild Motorola into a flagship hardware showcase for Google's Android software. Internally, and according to later industry analysis, the acquisition was driven at least as much by Motorola's deep portfolio of wireless patents, seen as crucial ammunition in the smartphone patent wars raging between Apple, Samsung, and Google's own Android partners. Shortly after the deal closed, Google laid off roughly one-fifth of Motorola Mobility's workforce, close to 4,000 people, and shut down about a third of its offices worldwide. For engineers and designers who had joined Motorola specifically because of its decades-long reputation as an inventor rather than an imitator, the reality of becoming, in effect, a patent vault for a much larger Silicon Valley company was a difficult adjustment. Some of the deepest institutional knowledge in the building, expertise in radio engineering that stretched back in a direct professional lineage to the walkie-talkies of the 1940s and the Dynatak of the 1970s, now existed primarily to protect a software platform Motorola itself did not control. There is a particular kind of quiet grief that belongs to engineers who watch a company's purpose narrow around them without any single dramatic announcement marking the change. No executive stood in front of Motorola's workforce and declared that invention was no longer the company's primary mission. Instead, the shift showed up in smaller signals: which projects received funding and which were quietly shelved, which teams grew and which were folded into other departments, how often the word patent appeared in leadership communications compared to how often the word breakthrough once had. For people who had spent careers measuring their worth by what they had helped create, that narrowing was its own form of loss, long before any formal layoff notice arrived. Under Google's ownership, Motorola did produce phones that critics genuinely admired, including the Moto X, praised for its emphasis on customization and user experience rather than raw specifications. But Google faced a delicate problem of its own making. It could not push Motorola too far ahead of other Android manufacturers, particularly Samsung, without alienating the very partners the Android ecosystem depended on. Motorola, once the company that set the pace for the entire industry, was now constrained from leading its own platform. Financial records from the period tell their own quiet story. Across roughly a year and a half under Google's ownership, Motorola's mobile division accumulated close to $2 billion in operating losses, a pace no parent company, however patient, could sustain indefinitely. The moment many inside the company understood the mobile phone chapter of Motorola's story was truly ending came in January 2014, when Google's chief executive announced in a public blog post that Motorola Mobility would be sold to the Chinese technology company Lenovo for $2.91 billion, barely a quarter of what Google had paid less than 2 years earlier, and a fraction of what the company had once been worth as the inventor of an entire industry. Franchise-level detail matters here in a way pure statistics cannot capture. Engineers who had spent 20 or 30 years at Motorola, some of whom had joined specifically because the company represented the pinnacle of American radio and telecommunications engineering, found themselves working through 2 ownership changes in 3 years, each time being asked to prove their value to an entirely new corporate parent with different priorities and a different definition of success. Some left the industry altogether. Others followed the technology to competitors, taking with them institutional knowledge that had once made Motorola nearly impossible to challenge. And who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had spent their working lives building that industry, once the corporations above them decided the brand itself was simply an asset to be flipped? There was no single storefront that closed its gates, no dramatic bankruptcy announcement carried on the evening news, the way there might have been for a shuttered department store chain or a bankrupt airline. Motorola's collapse as an independent American company happened instead through a sequence of transactions, each one smaller and more diminished than the last, until the company that had invented the mobile phone no longer belonged to the country that built it. The unraveling took roughly 7 years from its first visible sign to its final chapter. It began quietly in 2007 when the iPhone's launch triggered the sales decline inside Motorola's phone division. It accelerated sharply between 2007 and 2009 as the company absorbed more than $4 billion in losses. It reached a formal turning point on January 4, 2011, when Motorola split itself in two, publicly acknowledging that its historic phone business and its steadier public safety business could no longer be run as one company. And it reached its most symbolically final moment on October 30th, 2014, when Lenovo completed its purchase of Motorola Mobility from Google. The moment American ownership of the brand that had once defined an entire category of technology effectively came to an end. Each stage of that timeline carried its own particular weight for the people living through it. The 2011 split was, for many longtime employees, the first unmistakable public admission that the company they had devoted careers to no longer believed its own consumer phone division could compete on its own merits. Motorola Solutions, the half of the business that kept the profitable radio and public safety contracts, moved forward with a measure of stability. Motorola Mobility, the half carrying the Razor's legacy and the smartphone struggle, was set adrift as an independent public company with an uncertain runway and an increasingly urgent need for either a turnaround or a buyer. That buyer arrived within 18 months, and for a brief period in 2012, there was genuine hope inside the company that Google's backing, with its enormous resources and its central role in the Android ecosystem Motorola phones already ran on, might finally give Motorola's engineers the software partnership they had needed since 2007. Some employees described those early months under Google's ownership with real optimism, encouraged by Google's public statements about rebuilding Motorola into a flagship Android brand. That optimism collided quickly with the layoffs that followed the deal's closing, and with the recognition that Google's strategic interest in Motorola's patents did not necessarily translate into a long-term commitment to Motorola's phones. For employees who had spent decades inside Motorola's Illinois offices and factories, the emotional weight of that sequence did not arrive all at once. It arrived in waves, the layoffs that followed Google's 2012 acquisition, when close to 4,000 people learned in a single announcement that their positions no longer fit into the new company's plans, and entire offices around the world were told they would simply cease to exist. It arrived again in 2014 when longtime employees who had weathered one ownership change already learned they were being handed to an entirely new corporate parent, headquartered on the other side of the world, that had no direct history with the products they had spent careers building. For customers, the collapse was felt less as a single event and more as a slow erosion of trust and familiarity. Where a family in 2004 might have walked into a wireless store and reached instinctively for a Motorola Razr, the same family a decade later found Motorola phones sitting quietly on a lower shelf, overshadowed by iPhones and Samsung Galaxy devices that had become the new default. There was no single last purchase, no locked storefront door for former loyalists to gather in front of, the way there might be for a department store's final liquidation sale. There was only a gradual sense, spreading across millions of households, that the name that had once meant the cutting edge of American technology had quietly stopped being anyone's first choice. For many longtime Motorola customers, the realization arrived at the moment of an ordinary upgrade, standing in a carrier store, phone contract expiring, reaching out of habit toward the Motorola display, only to be gently steered by a salesperson toward an iPhone or a Galaxy device instead, on the grounds that it was simply what most customers were buying now. There was no single dramatic break in loyalty. There was instead 1,000 small conversations like that one, repeated across the country, each one quietly rewriting which brand a family would reach for out of habit the next time around. Inside Motorola's remaining offices, the collapse was measured in smaller, more immediate terms. Quarterly product roadmaps that shrank year over year, design teams consolidated or eliminated, hallways that had once hummed with the energy of a company racing to ship the next Razr variant, now considerably quieter. Longtime employees who remembered the frantic pace of 2004 and 2005 described the years following 2007 as a slow, uncomfortable deceleration. Not the sudden shock of a single layoff notice, but a gradual sense that the company's center of gravity had shifted somewhere else, to Cupertino and to Seoul, and was never coming back. The trade press covering the technology industry in those years tracked the decline in market share reports and quarterly earnings calls, the ordinary vocabulary of a business story. What that coverage rarely captured was the particular ache of watching a hometown institution lose its place at the center of an industry it had built from nothing. In Chicago area newspapers, occasional retrospective pieces would appear, marking some anniversary of the Dynatac or the Russer, treating Motorola's early triumphs with genuine local pride, even as the company's present-day struggles went largely unmentioned in the same articles. As if the city itself was not yet ready to fully reconcile the two halves of the story. Media coverage of the story, when it came, tended to focus on the financial mechanics rather than the human loss. Headlines about billions gained and billions lost, about patent portfolios and Android market share. Few outlets paused to mark what the moment actually meant, that the company responsible for the very first phone call ever made on a public sidewalk, the company that had turned an entire generation of Americans into people who expected to be reachable anywhere, had been sold twice in 3 years for a price far below what it had once been worth, and had ended up in the hands of a company an ocean away from the small office on Harrison Street where it all began. When Google's chief executive published the announcement of the Lenovo sale in January 2014, he framed the decision in his own public statement as a matter of focus, a recognition that Google was better suited to building software platforms than running a hardware manufacturer, and that Motorola's engineering talent would find a more natural home under a company whose entire business was built around making phones. For the employees reading that announcement from inside Motorola's own offices, the reasoning may have been sound, but the emotional reality was harder to soften. A company with an 86-year history of American ownership, invention, and manufacturing was being reassigned, for the second time in 3 years, to a new owner that had no part in building it. The most concrete sign of the unraveling showed up in the numbers themselves. In the 2 years Google owned Motorola Mobility, the division never turned a sustained profit, and the $12.5 billion purchase price had shrunk by the time of the Lenovo sale to barely a quarter of that figure. Wall Street analysts described it plainly as one of the largest and fastest technology write-downs in recent memory. But for the engineers, designers, and factory workers whose careers were bound up in that number, the loss was never really about billions of dollars. It was about watching a company that had once led an entire industry become, within a single decade, a line item in someone else's balance sheet. There was no single final day to point to, no last customer walking out with a bag, no manager turning a key in a lock for the last time. What there was instead was a name, the same 5 letters that had once meant the future itself, now attached to phones designed and marketed by an entirely different corporate lineage, still sold, still functional, but no longer carrying the story of the family that built it from $565 and 5 employees in 1928. Something had been lost in that transaction that no balance sheet could measure, and it would take the people who lived through Motorola's rise to explain years later exactly what that something was. For a company that had spent its first 8 decades defined almost entirely by what it built, the final years of the story were defined instead by what it was sold for, a series of dollar figures, each one smaller and more diminished than the one before it, standing in for an act of American invention that no number could ever fully capture. What replaced Motorola in American pockets was not one company, but two. Apple, whose iPhone had exposed the software gap Motorola never closed, and Samsung, whose Galaxy line absorbed much of the Android market Motorola had once hoped to lead itself. Between them, they came to define the smartphone era so completely that an entire generation of Americans grew up with almost no memory of Motorola as anything other than a name occasionally seen on a budget phone at a discount carrier. The revival, when it came, arrived from an unexpected direction. Under Lenovo's ownership, Motorola's mobile division did not disappear entirely. It found a quieter, more affordable niche with the Moto G series, budget-friendly Android phones that by 2020 had sold more than 100 million units combined since their 2013 introduction, according to the company's own disclosures. In November 2019, Lenovo went further, reviving the Razr name itself as a modern, foldable smartphone, a direct nod to the phone's mid-2000s cultural peak, aimed squarely at the nostalgia of the very generation that had once carried the original. Not everything from Motorola's original American identity was lost. Motorola Solutions, the half of the company that split away from the consumer phone business in 2011, remained an independent, publicly traded American company, still headquartered in Chicago, still building the mission-critical communication systems used by police departments and emergency responders across the country. A quiet, less glamorous continuation of the very same instinct that had once driven Paul Galvin to sell car radios to police departments back in 1930. The broader lesson of Motorola's fall reached well beyond one company's fortunes. It became one of the most cited cautionary tales in American business schools and technology journalism about the danger of mistaking past dominance for permanent advantage. A company could genuinely invent an entire industry, as Motorola had, and still lose control of it within a single decade if it failed to recognize when the terms of competition had fundamentally changed. Hardware alone, no matter how elegant or well-engineered, was no longer enough once the real battleground moved to software and the experience built on top of it. That lesson carried an especially sharp edge because of how completely Motorola had once defined its category. This was not a company playing catch-up in a market someone else had created. This was the company that had built the market from a $100 million bet and a decade of patient engineering, only to watch a company with no prior history in telephones, a company that made its money from web search, become the one that decided what a phone should look like for the next 20 years. Few case studies in American technology history illustrate more clearly how quickly an advantage that took 80 years to build can be lost within a single product cycle. For the city of Chicago and the surrounding suburbs, where Motorola had employed tens of thousands of people across nearly 9 decades, the impact rippled outward in ways not always visible in national headlines. Engineers who had built careers designing radios and phones, finding themselves searching for new roles in a technology landscape, reshaped almost entirely around software. In a region that had once considered itself a genuine capital of American telecommunications manufacturing. In 2016, Motorola Solutions moved its global headquarters back into the city of Chicago itself, to a building on West Monroe Street, marking a symbolic return to the urban roots of a company founded on Harrison Street nearly 90 years earlier. It was a modest kind of homecoming, largely unnoticed outside business trade publications, but it represented something real. A piece of Paul Galvin's original company was still standing, still American, still headquartered in the city where $565 once bought a battery eliminator business and a shot at reinvention. For the Razr generation especially, the 2019 return of the Razr name as a foldable smartphone carried an emotional resonance that went well beyond ordinary product marketing. Here was a company, now under entirely foreign ownership, reaching back deliberately into its own American cultural peak to sell a new generation of consumers on a feeling their parents remembered firsthand. Proof that even after losing the industry it built, Motorola's name still carried enough nostalgic weight to matter. For the employees who had lived through the entire arc, the Razr's triumph, the iPhone's arrival, 2 changes of corporate ownership, and finally the foldable revival of a name they had once helped make famous, there was a particular, complicated pride in watching that comeback unfold. The company they had worked for no longer set the direction of the industry the way it once had, but the name itself and the specific memories tied to it had proven durable enough to outlast the American ownership that first built it. What does it mean for a country to lose the company that first taught it what a wireless life could feel like, even as the devices themselves never actually left anyone's pocket? Somewhere tonight, in a kitchen drawer or a shoebox in a closet, an old Motorola flip phone is still sitting exactly where it was left the day its owner finally switched to something newer. The battery is long dead. The screen no longer lights. But pick it up, and the hinge still moves the way it always did, and the shell still carries that particular weight, heavier than anything made today, solid in a way that felt, at the time, like proof of how seriously it had been built. Somewhere, a parent is still describing to a child what it felt like to carry a phone that clicked shut with a sound like a small, satisfying period at the end of a sentence. Motorola mattered to American life for reasons that had very little to do with market share or quarterly earnings. It mattered because it was the company that first proved a phone did not have to live on a wall, tethered to a kitchen or an office, in order to work. It mattered because for a generation of Americans, owning one of its phones marked a genuine milestone. A first job that required being reachable, a first apartment where a landline no longer felt necessary, a first flip phone handed down from a parent to a teenager heading off on their own. It gave families a way to stay connected across distances that once felt unbridgeable. And it gave an entire country for a few remarkable years in the middle of the 2000s, a single object that nearly everyone, regardless of age or income, genuinely wanted to hold. Before Motorola, being unreachable was simply the ordinary condition of being away from home. At work, on the road, out at dinner, out of range of the one telephone bolted to a kitchen wall. That condition had shaped family life for generations, in ways so ordinary that no one thought to describe it as a limitation at all. Motorola did not simply sell a device, it quietly rewrote the terms of what it meant to be part of a family, a workplace, a circle of friends, making distance itself feel smaller than it had ever felt before. What it enabled, the simple, radical idea that a person could be reachable anywhere, at any time, became so completely woven into daily life that within a generation, no one thought to call it remarkable anymore. That, in its own way, was the truest measure of what Motorola built. The very completeness of that victory is part of why the company itself became so easy to forget. The idea succeeded so thoroughly that the inventor's name eventually mattered less than the habit it created. The company that invented the mobile phone did not disappear. Its name still appears on phones sold in stores today, still carries forward in the emergency radios police officers and firefighters depend on, still echoes in a Chicago skyline that once housed one of the most important engineering operations in the country. But the version of Motorola that belonged entirely to the families who built it, the Galvin brothers who staked $565 on a battery eliminator, the engineers who spent a decade shrinking a car-sized radio into something that fit in a human hand, the generation of Americans who felt the future arrived the day they first opened a StarTAC or snapped shut a razor. That version of the company belongs now only to memory. There is no need to dwell on blame. Every company that ever led an industry eventually meets a competitor it did not see coming. And Motorola met one of the most formidable in modern business history. What deserves to be remembered is not the manner of the ending, but the scale of what came before it. Nearly a century of American engineers in a modest Chicago office and later in sprawling Illinois campuses, choosing again and again to build the thing no one else had thought to build yet. To the founders who staked $565 on a battery eliminator, the bet paid off many times over, long before it stopped paying off at all. To the engineers who spent careers shrinking radios into pockets, what they built outlived the company that built it. To the millions who carried a Motorola phone through the defining moments of their own lives, the story was worth telling and worth remembering, exactly as it happened. It deserves to be remembered not as a cautionary headline about a missed platform shift, but as the story of an American company that, for most of a century, kept a single promise, that the next remarkable thing did not have to stay out of reach. Something real and electric and American was here, and for the millions who carried it in their pockets, it mattered.